Hello and welcome to the Billowing Hilltop Podcast, a bonus episode of the Billowing Hilltop Podcast. Hello readers. As a special treat, we have a chat with someone who needs no introduction, yet here I am doing an introduction. Earlier I chatted with Jason Bulmahn, who is the director of games at Paizo, is the designer of the Pathfinder role-playing game, first and second edition. He releases other games through his own company, Minotaur. He's written a ton of adventures. He was an editor at Dragon magazine. He's just done everything. We talked through the development of all the editions of Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder, the maths behind them. That's math, American readers. The thinking behind the design of the various editions, what they changed in Pathfinder 2nd. I mean, just everything. We get into quite a bit of detail, and we talk about some of his other games, the hacks that he has developed around the Pathfinder 2 engine for horror and for zombie survival. There's a lot for you to enjoy. As always, we love it if you leave us ratings or reviews on your podcast app of choice. Throw us some stars. You can find us on social media at Billowing Hilltop on the increasingly awful Twix, at Billowing Hilltop pretty much everywhere else. If you're old, you can find us on Facebook. If you're older, you can email us at hello@billowinghilltop.com. Send us a question, send us a thought, whatever it might be. That's it. Let us push on with this special bonus episode of the Billowing Hilltop Podcast, Rules of the Game. Hello and welcome to the Billowing Hilltop Podcast. Today's a bit of a special day. We have a special guest to chat to, readers. None other than Jason Bulmahn, who is the newly, are you crowned? What happens at Paizo?
We don't have crowns. No, we just get different business cards. That's about it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's quite prosaic. So, director of games, I've got this right, at Paizo. Jason's been with Paizo since early 2000s, 2004, something like
2004,
that.
yeah. Almost 20 years now.
I think you worked on Dragon magazine. Then you probably were into the whole game design thing, but then you actually moved into game design with the Pathfinder project. Is that, stop me if I'm getting the
that's
narrative.
Close. I started at Paizo working as the managing editor of, technically I started out as the assistant editor of Dragon. A few months later, I was promoted to managing editor. Yeah. I was the managing editor of Dragon magazine through the end of its run in print form. And then after that, I spent about 18 months or so being the kind of design manager for Game Mastery products. So I was making Game Mastery adventures and split mats and cards and map packs and all sorts of stuff. And it wasn't until then that we got to a point where we didn't know what was happening with 4th edition. We hadn't seen a copy of it, and there was rumblings in the playtesters that maybe it wasn't too similar to 3.5. And as a publishing company, at that point in time, all we were making was the Pathfinder Adventure Paths, which was a continuation of Dungeon Magazine's kind of adventure paths that existed when we were doing those.
Which is what we play. We're doing the Age of Worms, which was
amazing.
Kind of one of those first three. There was the Shackled City, Age of Worms,
and Savage Tide.
Yes. I'm assuming you're an old school D&D. You got into D&D through D&D, if you see what I mean. You played what?
No, I started playing Dungeons & Dragons when I was 10.
Yeah.
And I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So, when I was 11, I went to my first Gen Con. And, I kind of grew up playing role-playing games. And I was fortunate enough to have a group that really liked to experiment and play different games. So, we played Vampire and Shadowrun and Mech Warrior and Paranoia and Chill. And, we kind of bounced all over the place. GURPS. Yeah. We played a lot of different games back then, but we always came back to D&D, right? Somebody always wanted to run a campaign. There was some classic module somebody wanted to run. And I did that, for much of my childhood through my teen years into college. And in college, I was studying to become an architect, and I graduated and started doing architecture work. But I worked at a firm that did kind of big government contracts. And some of those, frankly, get pretty monotonous, I guess. You're doing the same thing kind of over and over and over again, because you're like, in this case, we were doing a project where we were giving everyone who lived near the airport got new windows and doors because the airplanes are loud. And, they made their houses very noisy because the airport expanded. So we were just doing that over and over and over again in the large areas where all the houses were the same. And the funny story is I was working on this project, and I had all this time where I would have to draw up the plan of a house to give it new windows and doors. But once I realized that there was only like 12 patterns of houses in this entire subdivision, it became really easy for me to do. And I would go to my boss and I'd be like, I'm done. And they're like, this is a government job. You have to bill 8 hours. And I would be like, I guess I'll go check my work. And I wouldn't have anything to do. So I started writing a lot of adventures for the RPGA. So I started working for Living Greyhawk around that time, and I did work for them, and I started getting familiar with the folks at Wizards of the Coast. And there was a job opening in 2004 at Wizards, and I applied for it, and I got flown out. I interviewed at the Wizards headquarters. I chatted with all them about the possibilities of working for them, and I got second. They gave it to someone else.
Which is, okay.
But at the same time, Paizo, which had spun off from Wizards of the Coast a year and a half before, was their magazine division. And Eric Mona went with them as part of the magazine publishing arm, but he was working in the RPGA on Living Greyhawk. So I knew Eric.
I mean, he's like Mr. Greyhawk, or at least he...
Yeah. Well, one of the Mr. Greyhawks. I mean, there's a lot of Mr. Greyhawks, but he was our Mr. Greyhawk.
Yeah.
And when I didn't get the job, he had openings that happened because in that same hiring round, Wizards hired 1 or 2 people back from Paizo. And so there was an opening, and he just offered me the job. He was like, well, you nearly got the job at Wizards. Clearly, you know rules and game mechanics. Why don't you come do that for us?
Because that's a different thing, right? You've got adventure writing, you've got game design and game architecture, which is so weirdly, you kind of
I draw great maps.
Yeah, you do draw great maps. I've seen your maps. That game design element, because Dragon has got new rules, new crunch, new creatures, new whatever. So that is the fuel for that. And then at the same time, you were writing adventures that were appearing in Dungeon Magazine. I was actually told, one of our players told me to ask you a question. I'm going to make sure I get it right. What was the question?
Put me on the hot seat.
Ask him which of his scenarios is his favorite. This is a question from Graham, one of our players. And I think he means your scenarios. And if the answer isn't the Mad God's Key, he'll be very disappointed.
I have to admit, it does come down to either Mad God's Key. Mad God's Key was technically the very first time my name was in print in a magazine or book. Right. Dungeon 114.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You always remember your first. I actually owned the cover to that image. I bought it. The cover to that issue. It's hanging on my wall. It's right in front of me. Is my ongoing inspiration. But I think Mad God's Key has to kind of be the contender. I think Kill Bargle, which was the adventure I wrote for the final print edition of Dungeon Magazine, is what is near and dear to my heart because it is a 3.5 edition version of the adventure from the old Red Box, which was the first adventure I ever played.
And was the Red Box your kind of entry edition?
Yes. Yeah. The very first one I had was the Menser Red Box.
When we started, there was stuff from Dragon Magazine, as was. This is 78, I think we started. There was the original box. People call it the white box, whatever it was, with had gods, demigods, and heroes, and eldritch wizardry, and all that stuff. Box, And then within no time, there was the first advanced D&D Player's Handbook. I didn't play the red box or the blue box.
Is the basic expert companion master immortal, the BECMI series. Those are generally, like, I've heard those referred to as kind of the basic set because it was kind of a simpler version of the game, a little. The kind of growth and story of D&D is fascinating, right? How it is started with a couple folks bolting some things together. Then you had different groups of fans on other parts of the country building other things that eventually got incorporated. And it's a lengthy story. It's not mine to tell, but it is a lengthy and fascinating story.
It is fascinating because it's a kind of weird ecosystem of people. There's so many spaces to fill. That's maybe why you've got lots of weird little mini subsystems for different rules and different...
Well, I also think that early kind of design by committee, by group, and kind of hodgepodge cobbling together, there's a lot of charm there for folks who played in that era. There's a lot of nostalgia for that era because it was so new. It was so different. It was, going from... I am playing with, transforming toys to I am imagining a fantasy adventurer, killing dragons and earning treasure and renown. That is such a technological leap in terms of gameplay.
Yes.
But looking back at it, I can't help but be like, well, we've come a long way. And I'm not saying that to say that the old edition stuff is bad. It's not. It was state of the art at the time, but things evolve. And designing with intentionality, designing with an overarching principle of how you want the mechanics to work, frankly, just makes for an easier game to play. I love those old games. I do. Yeah. I still long to play a bunch of them to get back to those kind of feelings. But it's pretty undeniable that some of those games are pretty difficult to kind of fully grok. You have to really dig and learn and read a lot.
Agreed. And the dialogue around games, I mean, there's so much of it. A lot of that must be driven by nostalgia, I think. Because I kind of wistfully think of the old AD&D hardbacks, for example, as sort of my entry text into everything, all of that, right? And I associate them effectively with exactly what you're talking about, those early days of playing where you're like, what have we discovered?
Yeah.
What is this fantastic thing? Third edition, I think, was interesting because you felt that somebody had looked at it and sorted it, like systematized everything. And was that your sense? Yeah.
If you look at games through and understand, right? Anything before the mid 80s or so is before my time in gaming. Right. But, playing in the 80s, looking at all the games that existed then, you crest into the 90s, you start seeing some new games that frankly rise in popularity pretty quick. You look at Vampire, Shadowrun, and things like that, and you start seeing this first kind of approach to game design that has a deliberative process about it. That doesn't mean that D&D wasn't built with a deliberative process, but has a bit more of an outset of like, we are going to build this game environment. We want the game to feel this way. We want the mechanics to empower this feeling. And, you see that in those games. But D&D is still kind of muddling with second edition. And, second edition was fine. I played more second than I did first in the grand scheme of things, just because of where I grew up and when I grew up. But third was revolutionary because third brought some of those ideas in, and it said, here is a unified rule system. Here are a bunch of maxims that you can tell people and be like, this is universally true. And that worked, right? Hey, rolling high is always going to be good. We're going to get rid of any system that says sometimes rolling low is good and other times rolling high is good.
Yeah.
We're going to get rid of, having to do reverse math with THACO. Right?
Yes.
Nobody wants to do that. Right? We all make fun of it now.
THACO was like the windows you were putting in the houses when the airport got loud. It's like, we've got a problem we've got to address. We'll put a compensatory measure in to make it seem systematized, but really
it's a patch.
But it's a patch. Yeah, precisely.
Yeah. And to be honest, it also made another revolution to our entire industry, which was the open game. Right. Saying, giving everybody else safe harbor to make things compatible with the game without the threat of being sued. Removed all of the past stigma that you had, all of the conflicts you saw with roll aids and all the kind of stuff that came before. And basically the entire industry, all of whom mostly grew up at that point in time playing D&D, looked at that and went, finally, I can just make some D&D stuff.
And there was an explosion. I mean, there was just...
it was everywhere. And frankly, Pathfinder comes out of that eventually. Pathfinder is, in some ways, the end stage to the 3.0 equation, which was what happens when the game company that's making 3.0, 3.5 moves on to a different game set and leaves the previous one sitting there. And, at the time, circling back around to my entry into this, I was working on game mastery modules at Paizo. I wasn't, it was fine work, but it wasn't creatively very fulfilling. It was small little accessories and stuff. And WotC tried to hire me again in that period of time. They headhunted me and like reached out to me and said, hey, we want to bring you on board. And I interviewed with them again, and then they gave it to somebody else again. And and I was left kind of being in a space where I didn't feel very creatively fulfilled. And I remember going home that night once I heard the news, and I was like, they're going to leave 3.5 behind. Nobody's doing anything with it. I'm just going to write up my rules changes because I'm tired of certain elements of this game that I don't think work particularly well. And I'm going to change them. I'm going to create my own document that just talks about my rules changes at this point in time, I was like, maybe I'll put them on this new site, Drive Through RPG. That sounds cool. and I could sell them there as just a PDF. And it wasn't quite the newest thing at that point in time, but it was still relatively nascent at that point.
So it's just a side. This is just your own personal side.
This is my own side thing. Nothing at this point in time. And I think I spent 3 or 4 months tinkering around with it and just building it out. And Paizo at this point in time, we had a license to do Dungeon and Dragon magazine. And they decided to take those online, so we lost the license. And the end result was we were making adventure paths, but we were also making those adventure paths for 3.5 and the OGL. And there was coming this new edition of the game, and you kind of hit a point in your production cycle where it's like, well, we have to be working on the thing that comes out at Next Gen Con.
Yeah.
And Next Gen Con is going to be after 4th edition is out. So we can't make stuff. We're running out of time. So we had kind of a big meeting just to talk about it because we hadn't seen the rules and we hadn't seen the license. And there was a lot of worry that we weren't going to get to see it until, 8 months later. And you can't, in the game industry, you can't go 8 months without making a thing. That's terrible.
Yeah, so it's this kind of vacuum, this info vacuum. You're just left hanging. Right. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So we had a big meeting at the owner's house and I kind of pulled out my document and I was just like, well, I've been making this. and later on, I think it was the next week I became the lead designer of the Pathfinder role-playing.
Well, there you are. Wow.
It just became that. And, that was a big learning curve. And, we kind of built the game as quickly as we could. It was based on 3.5. We changed everything we thought we could change. But the game didn't really become our own until, the advanced player's guide and stuff came out. And we frankly, built our own archetypes and kind of created new systems to build into the game, made it more robust. I tried to file off a lot of the edges from 3.5, things that I didn't think worked very well.
I've read some of your designer notes and I've got the beta. I have the beta.
Oh, wow.
There we go.
There's not a lot of those. I think almost all of the ones that are in the UK came in the luggage of a couple of us that came over for a Gen Con UK that was in Reading. Yeah. I want to say.
Yeah, Reading. I'm not too far from Reading. It's up the road.
Yeah, we were there.
That's probably the most exciting thing that ever happened in Reading, Jason, I suspect.
We were there in 2018, and we brought a whole mountain of those betas. 2008. Yeah. We brought a big mountain of those with us and sold them all at the show.
Oh, there you are. You must have sold it to a trade guy, and I got it in a game shop around the corner from where I worked. 4th edition D&D was like such an exciting thought. It was like, well, we couldn't wait for it. We tried it, and it just didn't, I don't know. There's nothing wrong with it. I don't think that it's particularly profitable to get into discussions about, what's best, what's right, what's wrong. But it's just about taste, and perhaps it's a little bit about resistance to change. It was like, we want a new version of the game that we play all the time, but we want a new version that is a development, not a revolution, as a consumer.
Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious that, I played 4th edition a fair bit, and it's a good game. It's well designed, it's fun, it's balanced, it's fast. It is such a departure from some of the things that everyone had come to kind of expect to be in Dungeons and Dragons that I think there was just kind of a disconnect there. It's just one of those things where it's like, when making a game, I honestly think there's kind of a promise you're making, especially when you're making a new edition, having gone through this recently, right? Where there are certain things that people identify with your game. And depending on how you talk about it and market it and kind of let people know about it, they just come to expect it. And it's kind of an exchange. It's like, well, this is what the game is. And if you change too much about it, if you make it feel not the same way, if the way it expresses itself isn't what people expect, it doesn't mean it's a bad game, but it does mean that it's not meeting their expectation.
Right. I think that was precisely I think that's what happened. It's odd that, I was watching a guy was doing a review of Lancer, Right.
Yeah, Lancer's really cool.
Talking about a lot of its design philosophies, it kind of works off 4th edition.
Yeah.
Some of the ideas in 4th edition, they have spawned, as it were, new game design. So it's in and of itself, it's a perfectly workable, like you say, very smoothly designed system.
I think 4th edition's impact on the industry is not small. It did do a number of things. It actually kind of stepped back from kind of a purely simulationist mindset where, everything about the game is about immersing you in the fiction of the game. And instead, it intentionally takes a step back to say, but you're also playing a game, and the game has certain constructs, and it's okay that those constructs are obvious because it lets it be easier for you to interact with the game. So saying you can only use this power once per combat, what's the reason behind it? It doesn't matter. You can just use it once per combat. This happens in board games and video games and all other places all the time, and we accept it without question. But I do think it's one of those places where all of a sudden the narrative and the mechanics aren't matching up the way that everyone expected them to. Like, Vancian spell casting is something that everyone's kind of come to accept to one degree or another. Whether or not they like it or not, they still go, yeah, I guess you can only put the magic in your head once, and then when you cast it, it's gone. Right? I mean, it doesn't make sense.
And some of these things are also meta. The player playing the wizard likes the idea that they're working off a system that is a different system to the player playing the fighter. Like, I've got my little bit of the book, and it doesn't quite work like your bit of the book. And if you unify, then you lose some of that delineation between the classes, and then you haven't got like, oh, I'm just going to flick through my spell book now. You don't get spells. And the fighter's like, well, no, I have got spells, effectively.
My spell is sword. Yeah. I think there's an aspect of that when you're building systems to understand that when you make things alike, they can be compared more directly, which then leads to deeper and more complicated balance challenges and game system mastery challenges. So, for example, I think, the way that spells work in Pathfinder, right? You've got people who are prepared casters. We still have the Vancian spell casting. And you have spontaneous casters, and they have spells that they know, and they can cast them as much as they want. But the fighter doesn't get any of that. He gets feats. You can't compare a feat to a spell. There are some feats that you can only use once per day, but they're a different cost. They're not a thing you get to learn a bunch of. Feats are a thing you only get a handful of. So they have a certain different cost. It makes it so that they are not directly comparable. And frankly, for the game's overall feel and balance, that's a very useful distinction to have. But we have different kinds of feats. We have skill feats and general feats and ancestry feats and class. And all of those are meant to feel similar, but we do put that name in front of them to tell you, hey, these skill feats really only affect skills. They're kind of small. Class feats are big deals. You want those, right? And
there are other things that you can do with semantics, like your 5th edition encounter powers, for example, right?
Yeah.
Which everybody says, well, that's very gamey. I'm not immersed in the fiction anymore. But if you have the long rest mechanic, the short rest mechanic, and you have things that refresh on short rests and long rests, you're really doing the same thing by the back door.
Yeah.
I mean, effectively, if you build your encounters to the point where you're really meant to take a short rest in between each one, well, then effectively you've built a set of encounter powers. You just don't call them that.
It is funny how often in game design, understanding how language and how you present a thing can impact everyone's overall enjoyment of the thing. One of my favorite stories has to do with a lesson I took to heart many years ago. Is about understanding a little thing they did in World of Warcraft, of all places. Right. And in one of the early versions of the game, you would take a penalty to earning XP if you played longer than a certain period of time. And the thought behind this was, well, we don't want people to play so long that they are neglecting their basic needs, and we also don't want to overburden our servers. Well, the players hated it because it was a penalty. So literally they just changed it to be like, oh no, you get a bonus to your XP after resting for a while. In other words, being offline. And you just get a little bit of bonus XP for a while, but once that's gone, you're just earning regular XP. And everybody's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And the end result is it's the same thing. It's just it's changed presentation. So encounter powers. Let's talk about that for a sec. You got a power that says you can only use this once per encounter. Okay, that's very gamey. Well, we have powers in Pathfinder called focus spells.
Yeah. And
they're basically a different kind of spell. They work just like a spell, but you don't expend spell slots to cast them. You expend focus points. And focus points is just an expenditure of your effort. And most spellcasters get some of these, and you generally start with just one. And once you've cast your focus spell, you can't cast it again until you take 10 minutes to kind of rest and refocus yourself.
Yeah. So
it's the same thing.
It's just a different right.
We just wrote it different. And we provided a fiction reason for it to exist, which matters a lot.
And your point about giving people different, even if it's really just filing the numbers of something and just reselling it as another thing, or the distinction between Vancian spellcasting and feats or whatever, in 4th edition, and I promise you this is my last thing. We'll
sure.
4th edition.
I'm not exactly much of an expert on 4th edition, if you haven't guessed.
And I couldn't be less of an expert. But the presentation was, again, unified. It was universal. As you flip through the book, the only thing that changed was the color of the little bar at the top of the name of the power. Is perfectly decent game design, but it gave people the impression that everybody's the same. Yeah. Everybody's got the same mechanics. Nowadays, that's perfectly cool. You would do that anyway. You'd say, in fact,
you see it all the time.
Right. You see it everywhere now. Yeah.
Again, the impact of 4th edition will be felt in this industry for a long time.
Yeah.
I think, ultimately, some of those changes were a bit beyond what people were expecting for D&D.
Yeah.
And, honestly, as the maker of the game that, frankly benefited from that a lot. I think there's a lot of people who assume that I'm some sort of hater of 4th edition. I'm like, no, why would I be? I mean, I love games. I do. There are some games I like more than others, but it's just not how it is, right? Everybody in this industry does what we do because we love making games, right? We love giving people the framework to tell stories, to get together and share a tale with their friends. That's what we're here for. And although it is a business and it is a job, it's still one that we all bring passion and kind of our own personal investment and joy to. So just not how it works.
People get very emotionally attached to what is effectively a load of maths, right? A load of maths.
No, it is. The story I like to tell everybody is that I've basically convinced a whole bunch of people to do math for me. Because at its heart, most games are just a complex math formula that equates to fun when you hide it behind gold pieces and liches and dragons, right?
Yeah. And on that, so Pathfinder 1, that became our game, right? Now, we played Pathfinder for, what was that? It came out 2009?
The final version came out in 2009. The alphas and beta were in 2008.
I picked up this beta playtest thinking, what can this be? I had a familiarity with Paizo. I had a familiarity with the name, and it was like, right, okay, well, let's have a look at this. And I remember leafing through it and thinking, hold up. This is what we wanted. This has got changes in it that we use a phrase, the Healy burst. I think it's channel positive energy.
Yep.
Clerics. Anybody, by the way, who's strayed into this podcast by accident, at this point, you really are not going to wonder what on earth has happened to you, and you probably want to switch off. Clerics don't have to use up all their spells healing other people anymore.
Yeah.
X number of times a day, they can ping off a thing, and they can send out this little burst of whatever, positive energy that harms undead, heals your friends, all good. And it's not just the fact that it made clerics more fun to play, which it did. When it was in its first iteration, there was no selective channeling, there was no targeting, which meant that crunch points in battles, people had to kind of run back, right? People had to reorganize themselves.
Sure.
And then all of those attack of opportunity rules, all of the positional stuff, all of the 5-foot steps and the reach and all of that stuff became incredibly tactically important because you had to get back within a certain distance of the cleric. And also the cleric had to get a certain distance from the bad guys. Otherwise they'd be healing the bad guys. And we loved that. It was like immediately played into our little, D&D as a grid-based tactical skirmish game thing, which a lot of people we argue backwards and forwards, by the way, constantly. Is it a storytelling game or is it a tactical skirmish? Do you look from above and know whether it's both. Readers will be familiar with this discussion that goes backwards and forwards. Is it one thing, is it another? And the answer is, of course, it's both. You were talking earlier about expectations. Satisfying both expectations is very important.
Yeah, you mentioned the channel change. And it's interesting because when I was working on first edition, one of the first things that I did, and this was before it was even Pathfinder, this was still when it was 3.75. That's what my document was called.
Yeah.
And it was basically me flipping through the book and going, what rules do I always have to look up? I'm going to change those rules. And one of them was the turn undead rule, because it was based on a chart and you had to make a check and then it determined what level of undead would run away from you or what level of undead you could affect. And every time I was like, I have to look that up every time. And ultimately, if I'm successful, all it does is make everything really complicated because the undead just run away. And running away undead means that we either have to fight them later or the GM just kind of hand waves them. And it's just no fun. So why don't we just have the cleric do damage? Because that's what we really want to do, is just destroy the undead. And then that also became if they're doing damage to undead, we could also heal the living, which solves up the problem of the cleric only getting to use their spells to heal other characters.
Yeah.
So the whole thing just kind of snapped together, and it was like, well, that's obviously the answer. But I think, again, this also hinges on giving everyone tools to kind of be the character, to tell the story, to do the thing they want to do. That's big in my gaming philosophy, which is, what's the framework of the game we're trying to make? And how do we empower the people playing it to tell the stories they want to tell, to make the idea that they have in their head be manifest? So if you want to play, a shape-shifting druid who is, actually a half vampire and hates the sun, right? We can do that. We can figure out a way to make that happen. There's a...
That sounds like one of our players, to be honest.
Yeah, no, it's actually not even that hard to do. No. And you want to pick up some wizard spell casting later. Great. Our entire mindset when it comes to game design revolves around enabling the choice and the control of both the players and the GM, giving them everything they need, but doing so in a way that isn't a burden. We just want to give you a simple framework for here's what the game is. Yeah. And then everything else is just an option. It's a module. It's a thing you can plug into your game if you want.
So I remember listening to a thing that you did. I guess it was at Gen Con, a panel thing that I listened to on a podcast or something, talking about the maths of, basically the maths of 3rd edition, which were the maths that were inherited by 3.75 and then by Pathfinder. I think you were talking about the Unchained? It was about how you couldn't break the maths.
Yeah.
To be backward compatible, you have to stick with the maths, but there were problems. I mean, am I?
Yeah, no, you're on the right track here, and this is something that we played around with Pathfinder Unchained, and that was kind of us doing some test ground stuff for things that would become Pathfinder 2nd edition.
Right.
Because ultimately, the problem with the 3.0, 3.5, and Pathfinder engine, because they're all based on this, is that there's an inherent flaw in their math formula. And that flaw is directly correlated to a change in your game experience that doesn't become obvious until you've played it long enough. So what happens is every character has, generally speaking, a save that they're bad at.
Yes.
And the biggest flaw in the game is that you are worse at that save at 20th level than you are at 1st level.
Because of a divergence as the scaling.
Because the math formula scales in such a way that you are significantly off curve at high levels, and as a result, you fail more often at high levels than you do at low levels.
Yeah. The DCs are scaling in order to maintain the challenge.
And as a result, that math formula also repeats itself in attack bonuses for clerics and rogues and wizards, most of all, in such a way that at higher levels, the cleric has a harder and harder and harder time hitting.
Yeah.
Or the converse problem is that the fighter always hits and everybody. So it's just there's inherent flaws in the math formula, and those flaws get expressed harder and harder over time, and you can't fix them without kind of pulling apart the entire math engine and scheme of the game and building it back again, which is frankly just what we did for 2nd edition. We basically took apart the math engine and said, what do we actually want it to do? So what we want is at low levels, we want you to feel like the die roll is super important. That luck has to be on your side for you to be victorious.
Yeah.
That your life hangs by a thread all the time because you're just a farm kid and you just left your village and you've got your father's rusty sword, and the difference between life and death is whether or not you got a full meal this morning, right? It is supposed to feel like you're on the edge, and then it's stabilized. You hit the mid levels where all of a sudden you start to become confident in yourself. The things you want to be good at, you're starting to be good at, but it's still a struggle. But we want that phase to last a while. We want that to stretch a good long time. And
the sweet spot.
And it's the sweet spot. But we want you to eventually make progress on that, to feel like you've gotten confident enough that your story now has changed. Right, you're no longer the kid that's fresh from the village. You're now the adventuring company that people call on to solve problems. Yeah. And as you go through that, and your legend grows and your power grows, you start accumulating enough treasure that you start being able to push the math away from you to the point where you get to high level. And when you get to high levels, the D20 roll doesn't become about whether or not you succeed. It's about how much you succeed. Like, do you get criticals, or do you just get an ordinary success? And you are now supremely confident in your abilities. You start to become rulers of places. Maybe you're plane hopping. Maybe you're doing all sorts of crazy stuff, fighting gods. Eventually you can do anything. But all of that is expressed in a math formula where the amount of bonuses you have in relation to the DCs or the target numbers you are facing and how those change over time is the whole game.
So I don't know where to start with Pathfinder 2. As a Pathfinder 1 player, the first time you read it, you're like, this is really different. And then you start playing it and you're like, well, it's not that different.
It's
but the
three actions, it's the proficiency system, and it's the 4 degrees of success. Those are the key pieces of the entire game.
The proficiency system is the thing that addresses the disparity between classes in terms of the way they work. The degrees of success is the mechanic that takes over at higher level, that allows you to have something to aspire to with a dice roll, even when the dice roll is as a proportion is not so much of the overall number.
Correct. Because you're trying to beat the target number by 10. It shifts phase.
And then 3-action economy just makes everything so much easier to understand.
Yeah. It just basically boils down the game to saying, it's your turn, do 3 things, what do you want to do? Right? Yeah. And I want to open the door, walk across the room, and attack. Great. Yeah. Done.
Yeah.
And the key is its narrative. Right? It's a purely mechanical structure that you can express in a purely narrative way. I don't have to tell you how many actions I take. I can just say, I cast Fireball, and then I duck behind this table. That's it. That's your turn. You're done. Right? Yeah. I dig around in my bag for the Alchemist Fire. I throw it, and then I, move over next to the Cleric so I can get healed around. That's it.
Attacks of opportunity. This is a thing I was told I had to ask you about. So,
sure. Reactive strike now in the remaster.
In the remaster, right? Yeah. Well, we call them attacks of opportunity fish, and we can't stop saying it.
All right. Yeah, that's fine.
You should have used it. It's too late now. My bugbear with third, the thing I always had to look up was, does what I'm doing provoke an attack of opportunity?
Sure.
Now it's simpler because of the manipulate trait, right? I think I'm getting this right. And you've choked it. Not everybody has them, which means that it's not right. It's not a universal, like, by fixing this, I fix everything.
No, it's
addressing a specific need, a specific
There are
case.
changes we made to the game that aren't on giant signs that say this is a big change.
Right, yeah.
Some of the changes are a lot more subtle. I think that, we kind of universalize the trait system to say, traits are a thing. They exist all over the place. You usually don't have to pay attention to them. They're just keywords to understand when something is affected by something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So if your sword does fire damage and it has the fire trait and something is immune to fire, it won't take damage from that. Right? It's pretty straightforward to kind of grok. How do you, trigger a reactive strike attack of opportunity? You take a move action or a manipulate action while within reach. That's it.
Right.
Done.
That's it.
Right? We don't have to spell out a complex list of things.
The list is the thing that used to drive me crazy. It's the list.
It's the list is look for these 2 traits, and the list of those 2 traits is actually in the trigger of reactive strike. So you don't even have to look them up. It's right there. And I think little things like that those were changes we made to the game because, frankly, we just wanted a cleaner system. One of the things we identified pretty early on in Pathfinder 2 design was just how many parts of the system were designed that I like to call exception-based design. It's here's what this thing does. Well, except this, and this. I don't want to have to do that. I want to do that as little as possible. I'd rather say, this is a thing that works this way. And if there are ways that it's not supposed to work, I'd rather have those expressed by kind of universal rules about how traits work and how kind of just the game texture plays.
Yeah.
And wherever possible, let's just trim those out. It's not that they don't exist, but there's far fewer of them because I do think they add to kind of the cognitive load of the people playing. Like, the more everybody at the table has to remember everything about every little rule from everything they're playing, the less time they can devote to imagining the fiction. And Pathfinder has a cognitive load, right? I mean, it is a tactical game. It has tactical choices. So there's going to be some of that. But we want to try and keep it as little as possible if we can.
To what extent do you think there's like parallel evolution going on with Pathfinder 2 and 5th edition? The reason I ask this is because we play 5th edition and we adopted it because we thought, well, this has got some really cool ideas in it, right? It's got some really cool mechanics. It's got concentration mechanic, the attunement mechanic, right? I mean, those are the 2 that leap out at me. And there's the whole thing with death saves and stuff, which is a kind of a bit fourthy, but whatever.
Yeah.
Well, the non-lethality of 5th edition is something that you mustn't get me started on. But
I do not want to get started on it myself. I've been playing too much Baldur's Gate 3 recently to be like, okay, this is ridiculous. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's just right. So there's that. But you've got Pathfinder 2 has got investment, which is it's kind of a mechanic around avoiding like what they used to call the Christmas tree of magical items. And is that right? Or
well, so in part of the playtest for P2, we did have kind of a maximum number of magic items you could have on you at any one time. Yeah. But frankly, folks kind of hated it. That was one of the things from our playtest that everybody kind of said, yeah, we don't want this. And we kind of looked at it and said, well, do we even need it? And what it boiled down to was just understanding that when we're making items, we can just kind of say that, hey, yeah, you can't wear any 2 items of the same type unless you have multiple limbs to wear this. Like you can't wear 2 cloaks. Yeah. You can't wear 2 sets of boots. You can't wear, 2 necklaces, right? We just kind of limited it that way. And then frankly, just decided that magic items would be, they're an important part of the game. Yeah. Make no mistake about it. But they are a thing that enhances the things you're already good at. And they're less about changing entirely what you're about. I feel like sometimes when I play 5th, there's so many like, okay, what can I get from this? And how does it apply to the second item? And how can I get the charges from this to activate this other thing for a third thing? And as a result, they can be very character defining if you have the right things. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, as far as whether or not these 2 games, I mean, 5th edition did come out before Pathfinder 2nd.
Oh, sure, but I'm sure the thinking was going on.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we were designing at the same time. We definitely looked at 5th edition, but I don't think we looked at it to be like, what ideas in here could we take? It was more like, okay, how are they? Because ultimately, both of us were trying to answer some of the same problem, right?
The maths.
Right? Yeah. How are we solving our math problems? How are we solving? And our answer is very different because our game kind of is constructed different. Our game emphasizes player choice and player agency at most steps of your advancement and process. Magic items are just another facet of that. So we want you to be getting magic items kind of all the time. A bunch of them are going to be temporary. You're going to burn them. You're going to use them. But the permanent ones are going to kind of rotate in and out. And that's just a natural part of our progression and kind of understanding.
I just find it really interesting that there was a point in 20 whenever, where it became increasingly clear to everybody that the 3E maths had to be addressed. And both Wizards of the Coast and you guys looked at that and were like, well, we're going to fix it. And you kind of fixed it in sort of the same way and sort of a very different way at the same time. And you've got the degree. I mean, you've got the degrees of success, which is obviously a fundamental difference. 5th edition just has you either do it or you don't. And then they've got the advantage mechanic. Again, very elegant, very straightforward, very easy to grok, right? I mean, it's just like straight away, it's like, I get that. But it means that I don't know. It's what we're discovering is we've been playing the Age of Worms, right? We've been playing from first. So we've got 17th, 18th level, 5th edition characters. And the reason we started recording ourselves playing it was just for once to finish something. If we started putting it out there and we actually had people listening, hello readers, sorry for our bumbling, hopeless buffoonery and play, that we would finally finish something as a group because we've been playing the same group of people, same players all together since 70, whenever it was, right? And so that was one reason. The other one was let's take 5th edition out for a proper run. Like, let's see what it's like from zero to hero. Yeah. It's very easy to play. It's very easy to understand. We were bonus masters in Pathfinder in 3rd edition. There's much, much less of that. But it's impossible for me as a GM to kill people, which I find extremely annoying.
Especially in Age of Worms.
I'm trying to kill people and I'm failing. I'm finding the non-lethality difficult because you need peril to make adventure stories work. And without it, it starts to get a bit tired. Also, they've extended the sweet spot massively, but maybe too far. Like, it feels the same. It doesn't feel very epic. It doesn't feel very mythically heroic at 18th level.
What you're talking about, I think, when I first looked at 5th edition was the one thing that I saw immediately and was like, oh, I don't know about that, which was they flattened the math curve. They basically made the math curve go from, 3 or 4 to like 11.
Yeah. Bounded accuracy.
And the problem with that is that from lowest to highest level, your bonus difference is like 7 or 8 or 9.
Yeah.
is just that everything lives within such a finite space that there's not enough room to express growth. There's not enough room to kind of really push boundaries, right? You know, being like, when you can finally get your armor class up to 20 or 21 or something, it's really hard even for later game monsters to hit you sometime, right?
Yeah.
And that's just, it's a facet of the system that is, you know, the advantage here is that you're never asking people, or at least not too often, asking people to add complex numbers. And don't get me wrong, I understand adding 13 and 16 is not that complicated, but understand that every time someone has to roll a die and then roll more dice and make a math calculation, then make another math calculation, and then the other side has to make 4 math calculations, you've suddenly added, you know, a 4th grade math exam to one round of combat. And it's not hard, but it's taxing. And we understand that in Pathfinder, right? I mean, that is kind of the price of playing. It's
an overhead.
Yeah. You're going to do some math. But I think the solution to that is, well, we'll just make all the math smaller. That you're giving up something for that. And the thing you're giving up is design space. You don't have enough space. You can't give as many bonuses. You can't give as many penalties because everything lives within a crunched kind of space of numbers. And that's just a hard place to live in as a designer. You don't have as many options. There aren't, like Pathfinder, we struggled. We got to a point where it's like a +1 is powerful, +2 is ridiculously powerful, +3 or 4 has to be nearly unheard of, because with you scoring crits at +10, a +1 not only gives you a 5% better chance to hit, it gives you a 5% better chance to crit. And that's a big deal. So like, you know, we struggled with that as well, but we also understood that we could play in that space because the numbers were big enough for us to play with. And I think this is one of the challenges with 5th edition design, is just that you're constrained. The box is very tight, and as a result, there isn't a lot you can do, and you end up having to look for other ways to give people fun things to do, like, oh, when, you know, this happens, you gain so and so many charges of X, Y, or Z, and now you can use those to do this and that and this other thing, and that's fun, but it's just a different kind of cognitive load. You've just replaced numbers with other rules, and that comes at a cost too. So
I mean there are benefits, you know, around bounded accuracy. You know, a hobgoblin is still a challenge for a 10th level fighter, and because of the well, I know, but I mean that's
but
sorry,
could it be?
Jason made a face that communicated his.
I may have rolled my eyes a hair there. I'm just like, why? But why does it have to be?
I'm just talking about the rationale. I mean, but my issue is that things feel concentration, right? The concentration rule with spells. It means that normally you've just got that one spell that you concentrate on, and that spell just changes over time. At earlier levels, you've got one spell that you concentrate on to the exclusion of everything else, and then you swap in a high level spell that kind of seems to do roughly the same kind of thing, that is just sort of more appropriate for the kind of challenges you're facing. You're only ever able to run one concentration spell at a time, which drives people crazy. That's one thing.
Yeah.
And then the attunement, well, you've got 3 items. As a result of the scarcity, they become incredibly important to you. Which 3 are you going to have? And it just means that you haven't got a golf bag. And the golf bag, I know, is a bit of a trope, but the golf bag can be fun, right?
It is interesting. One of the things that for us, the golf bag problem got mostly resolved by the fact that crits became more accessible.
Right.
So that it became more of it's resistant to this weapon. That's fine. I'll just keep critting it, and that'll do enough damage that we'll see it through the day, right? I think there are other ways around some of these problems. And there's no right way. There's no perfect answer here. There's not, we're all just making games to tell stories. So it's not like I'm going to stand here and say, this is the right way, that's the wrong way, because it's not the case. But it all comes down to what kind of story do you want your game to enable folks to tell?
Yeah, and what kind of, in the framework of expectations, again, around what we're really talking about is anything that's got D&D in its D&D in its DNA, that was easy for me to say, is the idea that ultimately there is going to be quite a lot of fighting creatures. Yeah. And therefore, if you invest your time in a game with that at the center, then when you get to those bits, you want that bit to be rewarding, challenging, whatever.
Yeah.
The 5th edition, obviously, demonstrably is incredibly successful. Incredibly successful.
I mean, so even if my job is to look at games and look at them as to what I think works and what doesn't work, or what could be better, what could be different. But there's no way anybody could come out here and say, well, 5th edition's a failure. I mean, come on.
Yeah, dearie me.
It's hugely popular.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, well, they've just brought out another. They've just brought out. You know, they needed books for Gen Con as well, and so they
absolutely,
So they brought out. You know, it's August. We've got to have another book, and so we have to have another edition. But the edition is so popular that we don't want to change it too much, so we're just going to kind of tweak it and whatever.
It's a tricky line to walk.
It's a very difficult line. I bet it's a line you've walked a lot. So let us talk about your hacks of Pathfinder 2.
Oh, sure.
I'd like to talk about Eventide if we've got a bit of time.
Sure.
Let's talk about hacks. So you've got Hopefinder and Hellfinder. Readers, one is kind of over the horizon. Is that Hellfinder? And
Hellfinder doesn't launch until November.
Right. And then Hopefinder is Minotaur Games is your own like mark, right?
My last name is Bulmahn.
Yes.
So Minotaur Games is my side company.
that had landed. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a
lot of people don't get it.
So how have you hacked them? And also Orc and OGL and all of that.
Sure.
How does all of that work? Because if you want to publish your own games, I know it's your own engine, but it belongs, I presume, IP-wise to Paizo. So how does that work?
Yeah, it does. But the licenses kind of allow these things to exist. So Hopefinder came out 2 years ago. I kind of launched it in October of 22 as a modern days zombie apocalypse hack of Pathfinder 2e. And what that means is that it still uses the core engine of 2e. You still roll initiative, and people take turns in order, and everybody gets 3 actions on their turn, and proficiencies are still a thing. Basically, all of that engine thing we talked about, all that's still there.
Right.
And all I did was I pulled out the entire class chassis, and I said, there are no classes.
Because there aren't any classes. Right, got it.
It's modern world. So instead, you have a background that kind of determines who you were and what you were doing kind of before the apocalypse hit. And that opens up a number of kind of trees of feats that you can then take as you play. And you
got it.
Yeah. The other thing I added was I added some zombie survival mechanics. So you can get bruises in addition to hit point damage.
And I read about bruises. So talk to me about
So the armor doesn't make you much harder to hit, but it does make you much harder to hurt. So a zombie can't bite through your armor necessarily. But every time it hits you and your armor prevents all the damage, you take a bruise instead.
Right.
So basically what that represents is that you're just getting battered inside the armor, right? The zombies can wear you down. And at the same time, I also introduced a damage mechanic for items. Items can take wear and tear. So armor and weapons can degrade over time. So every time the zombie hits you and it does do damage to you, the armor takes a dent and you take damage. If the armor protects you, you just take a bruise.
Yeah.
So over time, your armor will get degraded. You will take a bunch of bruises, and all these things are harder to fix because it's the zombie apocalypse and you don't have magic.
Right. Yeah.
I kind of tweaked the math of the game, but I did that all by adjusting the monsters.
Yeah.
Because they're the other half of the equation that if you adjust them, the game plays differently.
Okay.
And so the books themselves, there's 2 books. There's the Survivor's Guide and the Narrator's Guide. And the Survivor's Guide is everything the players need. The Narrator's Guide is everything the GM needs. And all they do is tell you what to replace in the core version of Pathfinder. And that's it. Right. And then you play it in modern time. That was crowdfunded.
Yeah.
You know, we sold a bunch of those. I have PDFs up on drive-thru. And I have those both as OGL versions and Orc version. So the Orc versions replace, honestly, just a couple of things. But you can also get the Orc versions via POD, which is really cool for folks in Europe because that means you can get them from Lightning Source in UK, which means shipping isn't outrageously expensive.
Yeah, because the shipping is the killer.
It's killer.
Readers, scroll down on your telephonic unit and the links will be there for all of this stuff. We'll put links to Minotaur, we'll put links to Drive-Thru, we'll put links to the POD, we'll put links to all of that stuff. And then Hellfinder looks scary.
Hellfinder's a little different. So Hopefinder was a, zombie apocalypse survival hack. So I keep the combat engine because I think that's fun and it certainly applies to a zombie fighting game.
Yeah.
But I add a bunch of stuff like have resources that wear down and exhaust over time.
Yeah, Got it.
So that you're constantly struggling to have the right tools to get the jobs done.
Yeah, all of the Dick's Sporting Goods have been looted already. And so,
yeah, exactly. Finding guns is actually a big deal.
Yeah.
Hellfinder is different in both its scope, how it's going to be presented, and kind of what the way I present the story.
Right.
So Hellfinder is a horror game, purely a modern horror game. It's not set in the apocalypse. It's set a few years in the future. And it's also designed to be a mystery. And it's a mystery not just because I tell the GM, hey, write a mystery story. Right. The game itself is a mystery. The game will come in 3 packets.
Oh, I see.
All of which are sealed. And when you first start playing, you're only instructed to open up packet 1.
Oh, we're going to do that. We're going to do this, aren't we, readers? Okay, yeah, okay.
And like the other hacks, it'll tell you how to build characters and how to play adventures, and it'll have several adventures for the GM to run.
Right.
And then the GM also has the ability to add additional story beats in there.
Yeah, yeah.
But it is a story set in a specific place.
Right.
And it is about this story. That is the only story Hellfinder is trying to tell. Once you're done with the whole packets, you could use it to play other games as well. But the initial run is going to be this main story that's kind of revealed to you over time. Now, it's a horror game, so I'm going to be changing some things about it as well, because Pathfinder as a core engine doesn't do horror particularly well.
Right. It doesn't do sudden death.
There's some death mechanics I'm going to change.
Yeah.
Character generation I'm going to change again to a point buy system to let you flexibly buy skills and feats and whatever you want.
Got it. Yep.
And I'm going to introduce a stress system.
Right.
You can take stress. It's like damage. It builds up. Harder to heal. You only heal stress by getting away from stressful situations and relaxing.
We've been playing some games with those kinds of elements in them, and they really work. Yeah.
And in addition to that, it's going to include a mechanic called trauma. And you can take trauma from taking too much stress.
Yeah.
And that'll be mental trauma.
Yeah.
And you can take trauma from taking too much damage, which will be physical trauma. And these will be things that stick with you and are hard to get rid of. At its heart, though, the game is also going to be less... Combat's going to be a part of it, for sure.
Yeah.
But combat is not always going to be the answer you're going to want to.
Yeah.
Because in some cases, that's not going to work out well for you.
There's going to be pages and pages of running away mechanics.
No, I don't need too many. I don't need pages and pages. But yeah, I think ultimately what I'm trying to do is just present a story that's a little different. That
sounds really interesting.
You are agents working for the bottom of the basement barrel of a government agency. You've basically been punished and sent to this agency. And I'm not going to give away any spoilers, but
no, we don't.
You get sent on a field mission and things do not go as planned.
Right. Okay.
And it involves a lot of things, and right now I'm being very mysterious and very coy. And as we get more people following it, more things will be unlocked. Right now, there's the main page. It's got an image of a early nuclear test blast. It also has some Morse code on it. Once you sign up, you get to go to a different page. And that page has different clues and other things that can be unlocked as we get more and more followers and get closer and closer to the project being launched. So... Yeah, I'm having fun with this one. This one's different.
Readers, I'll put links to this as well. Scroll if you dare.
Yeah, and that'll be on BackerKit.
Scroll if you dare, readers.
That'll be on BackerKit, and I think unfortunately I'm probably going to still have the same challenge I had last time, which is it's hard to ship overseas. But I think this time it might be worth it. One of the biggest problems I had with Hopefinder when I was producing that is that the final books were like $25. And it didn't make sense to ship $25 books to Europe for $45, right?
No, it's always been the issue, yeah.
But these might be expensive enough that it might be worth it for me to ship overseas in a limited fashion. I don't know. Or maybe try and find a partner in the UK where I can ship some stuff.
Yeah, that might be the answer. It is interesting that you've got effectively a core mechanic, or a set of core mechanics that integrate with each other for 2E, and then you can start to genreify them.
As someone who is deeply involved with building the game, I know how to take it apart and put it back together.
But well, yeah, you'd hope so. Otherwise, we're all in terrible trouble. And Eventide, then, I've got a question about Eventide. So, Eventide to me looks like a very interesting option for people who are not Galarian familiar.
Yeah, experts. Yeah.
Galarian is a big deal.
It's a big place.
And yeah, it's a big place. It's a pretend place, by the way, readers, just in case you thought Jason and I have lost our minds. You can take Pathfinder 2, and you can set it in your own homebrew world. It's completely fine. You don't need any of that stuff. But there is a sort of semi-expectation that Galarian is kind of baked in terms of...
A little, yeah.
You've got the game, and then you've got adventures, you've got organized
source
play.
books and all sorts of stuff.
All of that stuff, right. Eventide sounded interesting to me. It's a supported world for Pathfinder 2 with slightly different expectations and different themes. How does it differ?
So Eventide is my personal setting that I've been building for a few years now, and it's a thing I'm constantly kind of tinkering with and trying to improve and get some finished work out there. And at its heart, Eventide is a world where magic is fading. It's kind of like they're going through their own fantasy apocalypse, but it's slow. And it's so slow, it's more akin to climate change. Most people ignore it. But those who are paying attention are very alarmed by what has happened.
Got it.
And it's different in that some of the base assumptions of the game are changed to kind of make that story more realized. So, for example, primal magic does not exist in this world, right? It's gone. It used to be there, but it's faded away. So there are no druids in the game at all. You cannot play a druid.
Lucas, are you listening to this?
Gnomes disappeared centuries ago. They just vanished.
Right.
And the world is starting to change. But what's interesting to me is that the way I'm exploring it is kind of I'm focused on one town, right? There's one town in the north called Wormbone. It is the first town that we fully explore. It's outside the control of a giant kind of imperium that's to the south. It's a free kind of nation state.
Got it.
And it is a place where you can kind of interplay with all these story pieces and kind of get familiarized with the world and the game and the tale and kind of get pulled into the greater mystery of what is happening. Why is it happening? And what does it have to do with an event that happened some 200 years ago when for a few weeks straight, the sun didn't rise, the sky was black, and the world was in a chilling darkness. And that ended, and ever since then, things have been off.
And getting worse.
Yeah.
Right.
So Eventide is something I'm building through Patreon. I'm going to be honest, it's slow work because I do have so many other irons in the fire, but it is fun stuff.
There's another link, readers. Right, I can't let you go without asking you a question about the Age of Worms.
Absolutely.
James Jacobs was very kind to come and have a chat with us about the Age of Worms, and we got into a whole thing about how it was put together and the process of putting together these adventure paths over multiple issues and bringing in freelancers and story. But you wrote the Hall of Harsh Reflections.
I did.
We had to build a broom cupboard, Jason, in our play space so that people could play little bits of the adventure without the other people hearing. And that broom cupboard has served us. I have to say it was an investment that was worthwhile. It served us well. It's just behind you there. Okay, this is going to be spoiler-tastic, readers. If you've come to our podcast because you've heard that Jason has come on, and then you might be tempted to go back and actually listen to us actually play the adventure, then stop listening now, and then I will make a high-pitched noise or something later, and you can start listening again. Doppelgangers and metagaming, Jason.
Yeah.
It is a nightmare.
That's what you were going to ask about.
Yeah, it's a nightmare because every player knows as soon as the D word goes anywhere near any kind of adventure, everybody switches to a different mode. Nobody trusts anybody. I steered them to that the moment in Hall of Harsh Reflections in the Sodden Hold where it all pays off in terms of the doppelgangers, and it worked. But I had to do an awful lot of like non-committal language, and I'm very careful about what I said, and I really tried to hold them back to the end, so it was like a gotcha thing. It did work. How do you do that? How do you write an adventure with that element in it and avoid the metagaming that unpicks the surprise?
Boy, I think that frankly, there's not a great way to do it.
Right.
And it all boils down to the fact that you're in a room telling a shared story together, and there's not a great way for folks to share duplicitous information without it being obvious. So I think one of the hardest things, and it's been harder than it is now, because these days I think you could also just have it be in text messages or chats or something. And have people,
you can, of course. Yes.
You can have people work on their phones about that sort of stuff. But I think the key to it, and I've played with this a number of times over the years in various different events and other and things I've published. Yeah. Because I love this as a concept.
Yeah.
Even though I know it's really hard to do right, and you really have to have a group that's not going to get their feelings hurt when the whole thing comes together, and no one's going to be like, you betrayed us. It's like, no, I was just doing my part. But I think there is the fun of having that suspicion of one of you is secretly a traitor.
Yeah.
You want that feeling, that paranoia of it could be anyone. And I'll tell you the most successful way to do it, that in the end is kind of a letdown, but also is fun while it lasts, which is you're like, okay, I'm going to give everyone a piece of paper because one of you may be a doppelganger, and the piece of paper will tell you if you're a doppelganger. And you hand them the piece of paper, and none of them are doppelgangers.
Yeah, and so they spent the entire... They
don't need to be. They'll get paranoid over everyone's innocuous behavior. Now, the other way to play it is everyone's a doppelganger.
Right. Yes. Our doppelganger really did well. Put it this way. Our doppelganger did very, very well. And I was thrown a complete bonus, the actions of one player, without him understanding in any way that it was going to feed into the terrible trap that you had created for them, completely befuddled them because he went off in the sodden hold. He decided he'd had enough and he just left. And of course, from that point onwards, he could reappear.
Yeah, it could be another
where did he go? And it's like, well, they don't know. They don't know. It was great.
Yeah.
Readers, I think it's 43 and 44, those episodes. Anyway, we're just giving away what happens. But I haven't told you who it was, critically.
Yeah.
Jason, I had to ask you about the Age of Worms because...
Of course, yeah. I'm glad to hear that adventure is still tormenting people almost 20 years later.
Well, it's tormenting us, and our absolutely hopeless stumble through it is tormenting our poor readers who by now are 200 and something episodes in. Readers, how about that? Brief respite from listening to us absolutely make a complete pig's ear of this. Jason, it's very kind of you to come in to talk to us.
Happy to do so.
I had a list and we went through the list. We've covered an enormous amount and you've been extremely generous with your time. It's fantastic. That's it. We're done. Readers, we'll see you next time for some more Age of Worms stupidness. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. It's been fun.
The Billowing Hilltop podcast is a Billowing Hilltop production. Dungeons & Dragons is a trademark of Wizards of the Coast. The Age of Worms is copyright Wizards of the Coast. Music is from Kevin MacLeod and Incompetech.com and is used with thanks under the Creative Commons license. Additional music and sound effects come from the wonderful Sirenscape. All other original material is copyright Billowing Hilltop. Role-playing games are all about getting people together, and we use Roll20 as our tabletop, the perfect place to host your game, and Discord to host our chat. Thanks for listening!